7 Nightly News with Peter Mitchell.
The Eagles are going to win their first leg.
Lot further than Geelong. Good evening. The unthinkable has happened. Geelong, the hope of Victoria, has succumbed to the West Australian Eagles. The grand final, back at its traditional MCG home, was won by the Eagles 16-17 to Geelong's 12-13 in front of a crowd of 95,007 people. Mark O'Brien has followed the fortunes of both teams since early this morning.
5 hours before the grand final started, the Eagles fled their hotel to go for a jog in the Fitzroy Gardens over the road. Bermude's Cats supporters on their way to the MCG were able to size up the opposition as the players loosened up.
They do look smaller, don't they? You know, don't look so ferocious. Hope they stay that way when they're out in the field.
Up the Cats! Up the Cats! We'll have smiles from ear to ear at the end of the day.
There was an air of desperation in parts of the ground as some of the ticketless tried to get to the match. For some, money was no object.
300 for a seat. I want to buy one standing or one seat, please.
Police warned would-be ticket buyers to leave the area.
What you're doing is encouraging the scalpers, which we're trying to discourage.
A long queue formed for tickets from the salvos, but the traditional source had dried up.
People are just taking pot luck, desperate to get in and just hoping that we might get a ticket.
A heavy police presence or a shortage of tickets made scalpers invisible. Several hours later, the entry issue came to an ugly head. Hundreds of AFL members were locked out of the ground after their section of the Great Southern Stand filled hours before the game started.
Basically, I'm not very happy, and there's a lot of people around here who are pretty irate about it.
I think it's a pretty raw deal.
The decision about where AFL members can go has still not been made.
Half an hour before the first bounce, the seatless were allowed into an empty section of the MCG members' stand. Geelong players were given a hero's welcome when they arrived at the ground. Billy Brownless's mother was confident her son would fire.
I think he'll do very well today. I really do. I hope so anyway.
The Eagles ran a gauntlet of abuse. This game is not just club against club, it's an interstate war. Geelong is carrying Victoria's hopes that the Premiership Cup doesn't cross the Nullarbor.
Well, it is an Australian competition. It has been for some years now, and inevitably it will happen. This is the year.
We'll see. By the end of it, Carmen and I have always been friends. I'd like to remain so.
The game held the enormous crowd at the MCG spellbound. Outside, millions of others were glued to their TV sets across the nation, either at home or at pubs and clubs. The city of Geelong was enthralled by the desperate contest. And over in Perth, the feelings were similar. In the end, history was made by the Eagles winning their first premiership. Last year's runners-up went one better in 1992 to snatch the game by 28 points. The victors couldn't contain their jubilation.
Outstanding all year, you know, we had our ups and downs, but today, you know what it's like. It's what you played footy for and we've done it.
So the AFL competition becomes truly national with the coveted Premiership Cup and flag leaving Victoria for the first time. And for Geelong, there's always next year. Mark O'Brien, 7 Nightly News.
Yes, Peter Landy is at the MCG right now, and Pete, Geelong made a great start to the match, but the Eagles looked much fresher after half-time.
They certainly were, Mitch, and the Eagles produced that sensational fight back against the Cats to become only the first interstate team in 95 years to win the premiership. Even though the Cats jumped the Eagles, the West Australians clawed their way back with a blistering second half in which they booted 10 goals to 4. Peter Matera, who won the Norm Smith medal, booted 5, while Sumich kicked 6. Drew Morford has the highlights.
After losing the grand final last year, Mick Malthouse and his boys were determined today. And it boiled over before the opening bounce, before danger man Peter Matera had the first shot within 20 seconds. His marksman Bairstow not prepared to give ground. It was fierce, and when Gary Ablett collected Pike, his game looked over. But he resumed 8 minutes later. Geelong kicked the first 2 goals. Stoneham's on the run, a beauty.
Stoneham towards goal with the left foot. There's another one.
But the Eagles were astray, opening with 5 behinds.
And he's missed.
Generally, the standard was remarkable in the heat of battle. First-year player Peter Riccardi.
Riccardi, great goal.
And the racehorse Matera, difficult to shut down.
He sets sail behind with a mighty kick. What a goal.
McIntosh started well on Brownless.
McIntosh, marvellous mark.
But when Billy got going, he brought teammates into the game.
Cleverly to Brown.
And gave the Cats a 17-point lead at the first change.
Over the top to Brownless, goal.
Second quarter, and enter the genius of Ablett.
Works his way in front of, brilliant mark.
And capping it off as only he can.
Magnificent.
There's magic on both sides, and Matiro made a goal out of nothing despite the efforts of Bairstow. But the Cats led by 23 points until Tony Evans bobbed up for 2 goals in a minute midway through the turn. Matiro was a man who had to be stopped and copped it from all directions as the heat intensified to boil-over point. Brownless set up Ablett for the first goal of the third quarter, and the Cats led by 17 points.
And he's kicked it.
But it was to be their only goal of the term. The Eagles kicked the next 5, Wilson getting one from nowhere.
Like a cork in the ocean over his head. Oh, my word!
And that man, Matiro, gave the West Australians the lead for the first time since the opening minute with another special.
Sail for home, and the Eagles hit the front.
He scorched his wing, and remarkably, the Eagles led by 17 points at the final change.
It's going to be a goal.
The Will-o'-the-Wisp opened the last quarter with his 5th and clinched the Norm Smith medal for best of field. Peter Sumich bagged 3 in the last half hour with good leading. And the celebration started well before the final siren when the Eagles moved out of reach. Sumich ended the day with 6 goals and 82 for the season.
He uses that helicopter kick and it works.
The final margin was 28 points, and everyone associated with the 6-year-old club bubbled over with the realisation that they'd made one of the quickest grabs of power and taken the cup outside Victoria for the first time. The AFL forever and emphatically a national competition. Drew Morfitt, 7 Nightly News.
A great win, and I dare say it will be an even greater trip home. Down in the Eagles room at the moment is Tim Watson.
Mick, what's the feeling at the moment? Is it relief, excitement, joy?
I think it's a combination of all, but I think that the most, I spoke to you before about it, the first thing when the siren went, it was real relief, because you sort of build yourself up so much over the course of the year, and as the finals approach and you're lucky enough to get in them, and a few things fell our way and you just get tighter and tighter and tighter, and the final siren went, it was just overwhelming relief.
At what moment in the last quarter did you say to yourself, we've got it, we're far enough ahead now?
Well, I suppose I was holding myself back saying, well, they need 5 to beat us or 4 to beat us, and I looked at the clock, it was 2 minutes, so we had 28 to go, and looked at the game, we had 20 minutes to go, but I just can't let myself go before a siren goes. So I mean, until that siren sounded, I wasn't convinced at any stage that we had it.
Well, congratulations, and enjoy the victory with the rest of the boys and the rest of Western Australia.
Thanks, mate.
I think it's a different mood over there in the rooms with Bernie Quinlan.
Yes, well, bad luck, Mark. It's the second time you've been in this position. It doesn't get any easier.
No, certainly, it's a very disappointing result in the finish, and but I suppose the boys had a red-eyed go. We got out beaten by a better side on the day.
Yes, well, there's no doubt about that. But what can the side do to get that one step further?
Well, it's pretty difficult, with drafts set up, and we really have to keep working at what we're doing and keep the young blokes coming through, and eventually, they'll play enough games, to be a real good force for us.
When did you yourself feel it was starting to slip away from you?
Oh, at half-time I thought we were still in with a good show, and but they came out very strongly in the third quarter. They had a very good third quarter, but even at three-quarter time, I still thought we were a chance. The wind was not a factor. It was still, you could score both ends. But in the last quarter, they steadied and kicked a couple of goals and made it very hard.
All right, thanks, Mark, and bad luck. Well, you never know what will happen next year, so all the best for next year.
Thanks, Bernie.
OK, Peter, back to you.
Thank you, Bernie. And Essendon veteran Terry Danaher finished his distinguished AFL career on a high earlier today when the Bombers' VSFL reserves team won the flag. The Bombers were never troubled in their 33-point victory. Danaher kicked 6, as did Bradley Plain. And in the first VSFL Under-18s Grand Final, Terry Bright's Geelong Falcons were too good for the Western Jets, winning by 42 points. And from the MCG, Mitch, on Grand Final day, that wraps it up.
Thank you, Peter Landy, and remarkably, it's exactly 9 years to the day since Perth won the America's Cup from the New York Yacht Club. And today's news still to come tonight with a breakthrough in the SEC dispute.
GIL